Hi, and welcome back to Bean Talk. Today we have our second video of our coffee masterclass. We want to take you from an enthusiastic coffee beginner all the way to a professional barista if you watch the whole series. Today we want to talk about pour-over coffee, as it's a very interesting topic that you should probably know about if you want to become a barista. Pour-over is also the cheapest way to get started into your barista journey. First off, why filter coffee or pour-over? Pour-over is such a fantastic brewing method just because it's very simple, but you can get really a lot out of your coffee. Especially if you want to try more coffees, get into coffee, try to figure out what distinguishes one coffee from another, then pour-over is a great way to get started. For example, I have here a coffee from Kenya, which Kenyan coffee is very unique in its taste and very special because it's usually very acidic and has a lot of citric flavors, berry flavors, and that in an espresso, for example, might be overwhelming. In a filter coffee, it's not. It's very pleasant to drink, it's very nice and interesting. And so the huge advantage of filter coffee compared to an espresso is because it's not so dense, it's actually easier to taste some of the differences. And so, for example, to taste the difference between a coffee from Kenya and Ethiopia or Colombia, how they differ from the taste, or even within one country or even one farm, how a natural coffee might differ from a washed coffee. And because you can get so much out of the coffee with pour-over, that's why I would highly recommend to start with pour-over coffee if you want to get into the whole barista and coffee industry. And let's get started on what you actually need for making your first pour-over at home. You need coffee. And for this, I would highly recommend getting a single origin coffee, 100% Arabica. Don't put Robusta in there. As a filter coffee, it doesn't really taste good. And then as a light or medium roast, preferably from a local roaster or from a coffee shop in your city that you trust. And yeah, so I would definitely recommend that. As it's filter coffee, you need some sort of brewer and a filter. In this case, a paper filter. This might be the most iconic filter that's used in the coffee industry, which is the Hario V60. Really, the most basic setup that you need is just coffee, filter, something to put it into, and hot water in some way. So you can even use just your hot water kettle that you might have at home. Once you get into the whole process, you can refine it a little bit with more gear. First thing that I would buy is a scale. This is a very nice one called Akaya, which is also quite expensive. You don't need the most expensive equipment right away. It's cool. I have some expensive equipment at home as well, but for the beginning, you don't need it. One other thing you should invest in is a grinder. For your first coffees, it might be okay if you just get a pre-ground bag or have a barista grind the coffee for you at the coffee shop. Trust me when I tell you, if you grind it fresh, it tastes a whole lot better just because all of the aromas are still in the coffee. If you have the money, you can get the crème de la crème and get an electric kettle like this one from Fellow, for example. But to be honest, I didn't start that way. I got not a nice pitcher like that, but a cheap pitcher and just poured in hot water from a tea kettle that I had. So as you can see, you don't have to invest all the way right at the start, unless you want to, of course. But you can also just start and keep upgrading or buy small things. And yeah, it's also fun. We will make coffee now. First off, before we have to do anything else, we just rinse the paper filter and pre-warm this. And then we need coffee. What is quite important for filter coffee, that's why I would encourage you to get a scale as early as possible, is the ratio of coffee to water. In this case, the ratio that I usually start with, or my standard recipe, are 18 grams of coffee to 300 ml of water, or 300 grams on the scale then. Now we got our coffee ground. We've got our paper filter nice and wet. Next, we're gonna put in our coffee into the filter. But before I do that, I just want to briefly go over how we proceed then. First, we're going to pour in some water onto our coffee. So about 2 to 3 times the weight that we put coffee in, somewhere between 36 grams of water up to 54 grams. Somewhere in that range, but you don't have to be that precise right away. After we've covered the whole surface with water, we just let it sit, which is called blooming. We do that so that the CO2 that's inside the coffee bean can get released. Do not have this in the taste of the coffee later on, and also to have a more even extraction if you let this escape a little bit. After we've done that, you pour water on top in intervals. And this you can differ. For example, you can say you pour in everything slow and steadily all at once, or you do it 3 times or 5 times even. And that's something you can just experiment with. Of course, you have professionals that have very high opinions on how you should do it. But I think for now, I would just try to find your own way and just try to play around a little bit and see how you like the coffee afterwards. The only thing I would aim at is to be at the end at about 2 minutes 30 to maybe 3 minutes of a total brew time. That's the only aim I would have. And then try the coffee. If it doesn't taste good, try something else. Let's brew coffee. We have our scale. We put in some nice Kenyan coffee, 18 grams to be precise. I can just even it out a little bit. And now we take our hot water. In this case, I'm using 95 degrees Celsius for my water. Now I start the timer and pour water on top. And now you can see how there's some bubbles, which is just some air pockets inside that release air or the CO2 from the beans. And now wait until I have a brew time of about 30 to 35 seconds, and then I start pouring again. And usually try to do this in a circular motion with a steady flow of the water. The steady flow is just important so you don't mess with the extraction too much. Otherwise, if you dump in everything at once, you wouldn't have a very nice bed of the coffee. That's why you try to do it steady and always kind of the same. Now I pour again. Me, for example, I like to do 3 pours of roughly the same amount of water after the blooming. It's just a recipe I kind of started doing. And then I want to be consistent. I don't want to change too many parameters for myself. Now we hit our 300 milliliters, and just to make everything a little more even, I'm gonna give it a little swirl. Now we just have to wait for it to set. And we already have this amazing smell from the coffee. As you probably notice, it's quite a meditative process to do this. For me, for example, if you have a rush morning or something, you still have to take time to make your coffee. And even though it wakes you up, the coffee, the process itself calms you down a little bit before the hectic of the day starts. But one thing you will notice is that when it cools down, some other flavors might pop in the forefront of your coffee. For example, usually when it cools down a little bit, you get more acidity. That's why I would highly recommend trying it at different temperatures, your coffee. Maybe not too hot because you burn your tongue, but then let it cool down a little bit. Try it again. To briefly summarize, pour over coffee again. What we do need for your coffee is some sort of brewer and an appropriate filter for it. In that case, we used a paper filter, but there's also metal filters or other filters out there. Even though taste-wise, I would recommend paper. Then of course, something that you can pour it into. Then we need our coffee. Either you get it ground from your local coffee shop, or I would recommend getting a grinder and grind yourself. That way you can also later on adjust the grind size in case you're not satisfied with the result of your brew and think that maybe it should be a little finer or maybe coarser, but more about that in another video. Then you need something to measure the proportion of water to coffee. In our case, for example, we used 300 ml of water to 18 grams of coffee, which would be a proportion of 16.6 to 1. Of course, you can go along that and use this proportion, or maybe try something else. You're free to do whatever you want to do. Last but not least, you need hot water. Either you have a nice kettle like this one at home. Otherwise, just a hot water cooker that you have for tea or something else would be sufficient for the beginning as well. And you can also, like I said before, just use a pitcher to pour it nice and steadily onto your coffee bed. That's everything that you need for making a really great pour over at home. If you're not at home, but you might be traveling, then I would highly recommend getting an AeroPress. It's also quite a handy little thing that's super durable and can also make some amazing coffee. And so when I travel, I usually have it with me. We've made a great video about the AeroPress in the past, where we actually tried a few recipes, so you can check that out. The AeroPress also makes a filter coffee with a similar principle, a little different in taste, but yeah, also worth checking this out. But still, at first, I would recommend doing a regular pour over like a V60. To conclude once again, why you should try filter coffee, it's just because it's such an amazing taste. I love drinking filter coffee just because this is the best way to kind of taste the origin, the processing, the variety of the coffee, and also the roast. It's really to kind of get into the whole field of coffee or specialty coffee and train your palate a little bit on what coffee can taste like. This was just a little intro to filter coffee, and we're gonna cover it more in the future, actually with a very special guest. We had a good friend of mine in our show in the past, Martin Wölfer, and he actually just won the World Brewers Cup Championship a few weeks ago, so huge congrats, Martin, to that. That's really amazing. And yeah, he actually agreed to stop by our show in the future, and we will make an interview with him. That's it for today. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Also, if it's the first time for you to try filter coffee, let me know in the comments what you think of it and how you liked it. Also understand, of course, if it's the first time, maybe you didn't like it because it's too much like tea or something else. But yeah, let me know what you think. And that's it for today from the second episode of our masterclass. In the next episode, we're gonna dive deep into making espresso and what you should know about brewing your first espresso. Until then, drink lots of good coffee and see you next time. Bye.